I've like been in many rooms where I've been the youngest person, the only woman of color, the only person who went to a state school. These are all things that like I'm bringing to the table as part of my reporting, and I'm really hoping that that will translate to the readers, and hopefully that they will feel some kind of kinship with me and trust.
Welcome to the News Nirvana podcast. I'm your host, Nick Parker. The News Nirvana podcast features conversations with media professionals from across the country, highlighting our ever-evolving business models and showcasing the strong and effective journalism produced each and every day. This podcast is made possible to you by the generosity of Town News. Town News delivers solutions, services, and guidance empowering local media organizations to thrive in an ever-changing digital world. Contact Town News today to learn more how they can help you thrive. Connect with them at townnews.com. Alex Sujong Laughlin, welcome to the News Nirvana podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I always like this job. It's fun. I get to meet people from the news industry, but in every little aspect of it. And you are a writer and editor for the Cohort through Poynter Institute right now, as well as I think lots of other freelance gigs and things that you do with that. But before we dig into the Cohort and what you're doing, let's start with a little background, kind of who you are and what you've done in the industry, where your background lies.
Oh my gosh.
You have the next 45 minutes to give me your resume.
Oh my God. Let's see.
Well, I mean, is writing your background?
Georgia.
Is that your main thing?
It really isn't. I mean, it's my background in the sense that like I think most journalists have a sort of background in writing where, you know, they were like writing little stories as children or whatever. I was in college from 2010 to 2014, so like right after the recession, and there was really intense messaging that like writing wasn't a job, that you could not get a job in journalism, in media more broadly, by simply writing. And so I really quickly moved away from that and got into social media. And that was what my first couple of jobs out of school were in. I was like running social media accounts and, you know, being the resident young person in the newsroom.
Right. I feel like that's what we did back then, is we hired the youngest person we could and said, oh yeah. Go do our social media.
Yeah, exactly.
And so did you, I know you've done some audio work too. Did that just kind of a natural evolution into that?
Well, I would say it wasn't exactly natural, but yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to be a journalist in the very beginning was that I fell in love with This American Life when I was in high school. And, you know, I was always an NPR kid. Yeah. I loved public radio. I loved Radio Lab. And I just, you know, this was before podcasts were what they are today. They were like much more Scotch tape and bubble gum, you know, put together.
Right.
And This American Life and Radio Lab were the only ones that I had found that were like, you know, very highly produced. And so I really fell in love with audio at that time. And I went to college with a plan. I was like, I'm gonna work at the student radio station, and then I'm gonna work at the local member station, and then I'm gonna work at Georgia Public Broadcasting, and then NPR, and then Ira Glass is going to see me across the room and adopt me and give me his kingdom, and it fell apart immediately. Like the student radio station was full of like really cool kids, and I just like I felt way too uncool to be there. And so I went to the newspaper instead. And, you know, I interned at my local member station, and that was cool, but I was mostly digitizing CDs. I wasn't actually like doing any production or storytelling. And yeah, so I kind of put the dream of working in audio on the back burner for a while, in part because of the aforementioned, you know, post-recession fear-mongering. And so I got into social media. But I graduated college in 2014, and the next year, you know, Serial launched, the BuzzFeed podcast team launched, Gimlet was created. It was like in that time, suddenly everybody was talking about podcasts, and they were starting to become this like really cool, sexy thing in the industry. And I was like, wait a second, this is my thing. And like, it's, everybody's doing it except me. I was like so annoyed and frustrated because here I am like writing tweets, for a newspaper. And I'm like, I actually want to be like telling stories in audio. So I got a microphone from a friend and just like started a podcast where I was interviewing women about their careers, and it was really bad. Like, production was not good. I didn't know anything. But I produced it every 2 weeks for like a year and a half, and it taught me so much. And that ended up being what like I was able to use to convince my job to let me produce a podcast for them, and then eventually led to me taking full-time production jobs.
That's kind of the best way to learn to do it, though, right? I mean, I feel like a lot of us have that story where just, okay, I'm going to go do a podcast, and I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I started with a microphone plugged into an iPad.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's just, and it's a whole different way of storytelling. Even just interviewing this way is different than when you're interviewing with your notepad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because part of it is performance, and, you could have a really terrible interview with somebody for a print story or for a written story, and nobody will know what the vibes were between you and that person except for you.
Right. It can still be a great story.
Yeah, exactly.
And
you can
no
like really
one will know
turn
that
it
you flubbed
around. Yeah. Whereas like in audio, you can like feel the discomfort, but you can also feel like if something is going really well, you can like really feel the magic that like happens between people when they're having a really good conversation.
Well, I totally relate to you in the you had other dreams, and then the newspaper people got their vampire into you. I was that way too. I had dreams of film school in my head when I went to college, and I met the newspaper people, and they never let me go. So I blame them. I blame them for all of the things that I love now.
I mean, yeah, totally. It was a really dark time. I can't imagine what it was like in the journalism industry, like before I entered it. It sounds like things were really tough, and then got more optimistic, and then it got tough again, and I think
there's always tough, but we made a lot of bad decisions. We made some good decisions, but I think that's kind of what we're doing here with this show is things are hard, and for the first time in a very long time, we are going to be forced to make a lot of changes, and the way we produce news and the way we deliver news is just different. It's going to have to be. And so that's a little what we're doing is we're looking forward to that. And in that, we're going to lead right in. I'm going to force the transition here. And in that, it's the way we hire people too. It's the way we put people in the best role possible to create the news, to produce the news, right? So let's dig into what you're doing now. You are a writer and editor for the Cohort, which is a newsletter through the Poynter Institute. And I think anyone who went through journalism school in college has a secret love, well, maybe not secret, but of everything the Poynter does, right? We all look to that. So how did you kind of get into that role and connect with them, and then we'll kind of go into what the Cohort is.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually I didn't go to journalism school. I was a women's studies major. And so the Poynter Institute taught me a lot about how to do this job, more broadly about like how to be a journalist. Because I didn't take, basic reporting classes, basic ethics classes. I used their webinars and their articles to fill in the gaps of what I didn't get, learning on the job at the student newspaper. So I have had a love for Poynter for my entire career. And a couple years after I graduated, the Poynter Institute launched the Women's Leadership Academy, which is a program that is still running to this day. I got to sit in on one session last week because they just had their latest cohort come through. And it's this great program that teaches women in media, how to be their best versions of themselves and to both create the lives they want, but also create the careers they want, and to do their jobs really well. And I've admired that program my whole career. I have also applied for it several times and haven't gotten in. But the Cohort, the newsletter.
We're going to send them this show.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they know. They know. It's fine. But the Cohort, the newsletter, grew out of that. It was a way to keep the sort of good vibes and mutual support going in the aftermath of the leadership programs. And it was also a way to bring in people who, like me, weren't going to the programs either because they weren't accepted or they hadn't applied or whatever. And so I have just been a huge fan of Poynter and of the Cohort since it was founded in 2016.
You said it was there to kind of keep the vibe and keep the support going. Is there also an element of it though to kind of push issues?
Yeah,
to drive some change or drive action that results in change?
I think definitely yes. I think that one thing that I've seen really great to come out of the larger Cohort community, and again, I'll say that like as a person who up until recently has kind of been on the periphery of it, I've kind of been a witness to it, but I haven't been sort of in the inner sanctum of the Cohort. But I have had my own life, my own work life, massively affected by people that I know and love having gone through the program. And they have like learned things about, how they think about work in relation to their lives, and how, it sounds simple, but merely like learning how to establish and assert boundaries for yourself at work, that's a huge thing. And a lot of people struggle with that, especially women. And so I've benefited from, friends of mine being like, hey, I learned this thing at the Women's Leadership Academy. This is super helpful for me, this framework of how to do something. And like, then I can take it into my own work life and apply it. And in that sense, there's been like this sort of butterfly effect where like every year a new crop of people goes through the program and things change because of that.
The phrase you used earlier, just a second ago, you said work in relation to your lives. And I think that kind of that balance, that's the right phrase I want here. I feel like that's kind of the reckoning that's happening in the workforce right now, especially for those that aren't me, right? Middle-aged, middle-class, bearded white guy, literally wearing a plaid shirt today. But I mean, I feel like that's kind of, and I do like the word reckoning there. I feel like that's kind of a thing that's happening now, where people are realizing that you've got to find that balance. Look at the job market right now. It's about getting paid your worth for the work that you do. It's doing a job that you don't hate.
Yes.
So how are you digging in and approaching those conversations about that balance?
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because in a way this feels like the most boring and tired conversation around work, because it's at its core, it feels like the question of, can women really have it all? And it's like, we have been circling this question and beating it to death for like 30 years.
Oh, more.
Or more. Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to suffrage, 70s, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Even before that. But, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for generations, it still eludes us. I wrote a piece for the Cohort last week about parental leave, kind of inspired by, what's been happening in the news with the infrastructure bill and how parental leave or family leave got gutted in order to get the bill to go through Congress. And, I've had a lot of conversations with people, and what keeps coming back to me is that, there was a time when, you could just stumble into a newsroom, a sort of scruffy, know-it-all reporter who didn't finish school and just like stumbles into a newsroom, and an editor's like, I'm going to make you the investigative reporter. And, he just stumbles into this like, decorated career as an investigative reporter, and that is not what the industry is anymore. It's much more professionalized. I mean, journalism school exists, but also, the barriers to entry are much higher to get into the industry, so that like you have to strategize for years in order to get an entry level job. Like you have to be like playing the game for years, and like that has changed. What's also changed is the people who are in this industry. The concerns that they have with their lives in relation to their work, the fact that like we now have 2-parent households where both parents are journalists. That's really common. And yet the expectations of like what a career as a journalist looks like has changed very little. And there's still this sort of narrative that, you are kind of married to your beat. You're there early, you stay late, you stay until the story is done. Being over caffeinated or, on various stimulants that you need to like keep going is still kind of considered the norm. And it's like, the subhead for my article was like, why do we still structure our newsrooms like we have wives at home? Because I mean, up until this point, that's what my career's been like. And it's like, I don't have a wife and I would love to have a housewife. My husband is very supportive, but he also has a career. And so, I feel like I'm rambling into ranting territory now, but
I support ranting on lots of issues. So what are you hoping? So when you write this column, right? Mm-hmm. And I know some of it is you get to kind of get out some of your feelings as you look into these topics. But what can we really accomplish? How does a newsletter like this create, I guess, the community of support? I mean, you talked about how the reason you got involved was because you liked the community around it, the support, the vibe that was carried through. So how do you keep that going? How do you take a newsletter and make that? Or anything. You don't even have to say a newsletter. I mean, we do these podcasts too. And how do you create that community of support that actually, I mean, look, we all want it to either inspire or force change of some kind, right? Mm-hmm. So what's kind of your goal there? Yeah,
I mean, I'm like trying to think of how to
I know that's
handle this first because I have a lot of things to say. The first thing that I'll say is that I have been a fan of the Cohort and the Women's Leadership Academy, but my career has been such that like I haven't necessarily been the type of person who would have been eligible to go to that kind of program because I was only a manager. I only became a manager in the last year. This program is really geared toward people who are in leadership positions in their newsrooms and generally in like traditional type newsrooms. And that has not been the trajectory that my career has taken. I thought at one point maybe it would, but I went from the Washington Post to BuzzFeed, which is like more non-traditional. And then from there I went to a podcast production company and we're just like taking several steps outside of like what a traditional, news leadership path looks like. So I say all of that to say that as I got older, I realized that this community wasn't quite for me in the way that I thought it was. And that's not meant to be a sort of like dig at the Cohort. It's just like I have taken a separate journey. And so when I came to the Cohort, I said that one of my goals was to kind of open up the idea of what all of this stuff is for. Or who this stuff is for. And so I said really explicitly in my interview for the gig that, in any given issue, anything that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be thinking about the people who are most vulnerable, who lack the most power in a given situation. For example, like I think that somebody should write a great, thoughtful article about how to lay somebody off with compassion, like how to do that in a humane way. But that's not something I'm going to be writing, because the person doing the laying off is the person who has the power in that equation. So I'm going to be thinking about the person who's being laid off and like, how are they navigating this? How can you set yourself up? Because unfortunately we live in an industry that where layoff is kind of inevitable. So how can you plan for that? How can you make it so that you can weather that, tumult that will come? So that's one thing that's like really important to me, that I'm thinking about systems of power and how power is allocated in any given situation. And then the other thing regarding like building a community, a lot of my work in audio and in writing has been really informed by the training that I had as a social media editor. So I worked at National Journal, which used to be a publication, but I'm not really sure it is anymore. I think journalists still work for them, but I'm not really sure what they are. It was a political magazine for Atlantic media. And then I worked at the Washington Post on the social team. And in that time, I learned a lot about what it means to be a good like host of a community. Because it's more than just like asking people for, their stories, taking people's stories from them and publishing them. It's about, actually creating a symbiotic relationship where the person with the power, me, I'm like asking for something from the audience. I'm asking for their attention. I'm asking for their stories, their perspectives. But they have to know that I'm going to hear them, I'm going to respond, and I'm going to give it back to them. Isn't that
and I'm sorry to jump in, but
yeah.
Isn't that the description of the biggest change the industry is going through right now? Is this, that we have to create those communities. And we just had a guest on a week ago, and he was talking about how we just printed and we delivered, right? The newspaper industry was, I'm getting a printed product to this address. Mm-hmm. That was the relationship.
It's a very one-way,
right? And now what we have to do is we have to think about audiences. And he even used the word members, right? That it's a member of a community, and that's just what you were talking about. That look, we're asking for your time and attention and money. I mean, let's not beat around that, right? We're asking for your time, your attention, and your money to support what we're doing, to pay for the product that we're producing. But that's the biggest change, right? Is we've never really, until the last, I'm going to say maybe 10, 15 years, probably more like 10, we've never really invited the reader, the viewer, the listener in. We've always cherished our inner circle. You used inner sanctum earlier, different context, but we've always cherished that role, right? That we are the news. Mm-hmm. You just read. Mm-hmm. But to keep building and to grow and to change, we've got to invite them in, right?
Yeah, and I think that like part of what is really powerful, and I think that ties back to this idea that like different types of people are in newsrooms and they're creating the news. Thinking about it more like I'm talking to my people and I want to hear from them, as opposed to I'm talking to them. I think like, going back to women's studies, there was a concept that I studied for like a whole semester called the insider-outsider. And it was in a class where we were talking about academic research and like ethnographic study, going to a community and producing research on them, which is very similar to what journalism is. And we learned a lot about this idea that like it can be really powerful to go to a community that you're already part of and to be able to like share in the sort of collective knowledge that you also have, and to bring that to the outside world. And so that, again, is like another part of how I'm thinking about the cohort, is like, I'm not just like a random person who's like, I want to talk to people without power. I'm actually like, I do have power. I have more power than I have in the past, but I don't work for a news organization. I'm not a manager. I don't have a steady paycheck. And I've like been in many rooms where I've been the youngest person, the only woman of color, the only person who went to a state school. These are all things that like I'm bringing to the table as part of my reporting. And I'm really hoping that that will translate to the readers and hopefully that they will feel some kind of kinship with me and trust.
The News Nirvana podcast is brought to you by Town News, the creators of IQ Audience Plus. IQ Audience Plus replaces your old school, one-size-fits-all paywall with a smarter metering solution that targets visitors with custom offers, converting drive-bys into paying subscribers. Learn more at townnews.com/audience. Well, and I think you're a storyteller, so and what you're doing is journalism, so I don't think you can say you're not in it. I'll push back on you a little bit there. But what you're doing too is you're just making this is just a smaller production and community. It's a circle within. But I think that kind of goes back to that point of that's what we're doing is we're creating these little, because of the way technology works, the way that our news consumers work, right? They're choosing their hubs of news. I mean, look, we all wish, and we've got to find a way to funnel so they see the whole picture. That's on us.
Yeah.
But creating those communities within communities is important and probably the only way we're going to survive and thrive.
Mm-hmm. No, totally.
I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. I want to read. This was a line from, I think this was your first newsletter.
Okay.
And it struck me, but I liked the breadth of it. So I'm just going to read this to you real quick. And here's the thing: I would not start a pay up today, because if we've learned anything from the rise and fall of women's communities over the last decade, it's that spaces that center women without also centering complex dynamics of race, class, sexuality, ability, and the broad range of gender identity will perpetuate harmful power dynamics by only catering to the most privileged. And that struck me because from 30,000 feet, the cohort is about women. Mm-hmm. This is, as you said, it was a support group. It was keeping the vibe of the other programming that Poynter was doing. But here you are right out of the gate saying, yeah, it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
So we just had, actually, our most recent episode, Larry Graham, who just launched the Diversity Pledge Institute. So he's tackling DEI from a whole, not really a whole other, but from a different angle. How do all of these things really, and these are tough conversations to force to have, but we're finally doing them. So how are you kind of going to take all of those things, right, and put it into a manageable conversation?
What do you mean by manageable?
I'm going to say we already struggle anytime you bring up these issues, right? Of access, of equitable access, so when you say, it's much easier to go, well, let's just talk about women, or let's just talk about people of color. That's one thing, but you right out of the gate with this line that I think that struck me was, but they're all mingled together. They all affect one another. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's harder to navigate through the natural pushback you're going to get anytime we talk about changing the way we do things, like altering the status quo. We love the status quo. It's easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky. My editor, Ren LaForme, is like so encouraging. And, for my first reported piece, I was like, I'm worried this isn't gendery enough. I've actually said that to him every time I've turned something in. And he's been like, it's fine. It's fine.
Not
It doesn't have to.
gendery enough.
Yeah. Like my focus isn't solely on gender. So for my first piece, it was about the struggles of students and early journalists who are burning out before they even get a chance to land their first jobs. And it's about the higher expectations of what their workplace is that Gen Z has, which is really inspiring to me. I talked to a woman who said no to a job offer because she realized she would be the only Latina in the newsroom. And she was like, I'm not willing to do that. And she ended up in another job that she's really happy with, which is really cool. But,
I think that's a pressure that most of us, I don't want to speak for everybody else, but that's a pressure I wouldn't think of.
Yeah.
I would think that some people you'd want to be the first, like to make that change. But that's a pressure that I don't naturally think about. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, I can't speak for her all the way, though I have been the first in many spaces. It is a position where it can look really impressive from the outside, like, oh, I'm the first X to have this job, or I'm the youngest X to have this job. But having been in that position, what ends up happening is that, like, guess what? It's still really hard, and it's still like you have a lot of sort of invisible walls that are pushing up against you. And what ends up happening a lot of times is people end up not succeeding in whatever it is that they're trying to pursue. And the sort of unspoken thing that happens afterward is, oh, we tried. It didn't work out. And I'm just not interested in like spending time in a position where I'm trying to push walls down over and over again. I really commend people who can do that, but after 8 years in this industry, I am too tired. I can't do it anymore. Yeah.
Exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exhausting.
Instead of just being the storyteller, the reporter.
Yeah, it's like, part of why it's important to have diverse perspectives in a newsroom is so that you can, I wrote about this, like you can have lots of people who can raise their hand if something's happening that's wrong. Like, for example, a racial slur in a headline that somebody's like, I'm not really sure that that's bad. If you're part of that community, if you've been called that slur as a slur, you say, hey, we should remove this from the headline. But what happens is that these people don't respect the expertise that you bring to the table as a person who's lived this. What they see is a 23-year-old who's too obsessed with being politically correct. And they don't change the headline. And it goes out. And there's criticism. And like that is like a nutshell of like what it's like to be like an only in a newsroom or on a team, for example.
Well, and I think that goes back to the I'll push back against changing the status quo. Well, we've done that before. Mm-hmm. And what's a little cliche here, but a lot of times the worst biases are the unconscious ones, right? The ones we don't know any better. Mm-hmm. But we've used that word before. Not a big deal. And those are the things that we're working on, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's look forward as we kind of round out here. What do you got in the hopper? What are some things you're hoping to tackle? You're hoping to write about? I know you had mentioned early on in some of those first newsletters that you're looking to bring some of the readers in and to get their perspectives and ask them kind of for their stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's great because every other issue of the newsletter is just like readers' responses to the reporting in the last newsletter. So I have one coming out next week that's reader responses to the parental leave article that I wrote. Excuse me. So that's exciting, and I'm excited to share what people have to say, because obviously with something as personal and individual as parental leave, like there are so many experiences. So yeah, more parental leave stuff. But more broadly, I'm exploring things about, I really want to write something about funding models in journalism, and specifically, there's a lot of
Don't we all?
Yeah, women and women of color who have left traditional newsrooms to start their own companies, and the different ways that they've approached funding is something that I'm really interested in. I also really want to write about Slack as surveillance. I think Slack is surveillance, and I would love if we just were not on Slack as much. So just kind of exploring stuff.
This may be my age, but I was never able to get going on Slack.
Well, that's good for you. I'm jealous. During the Olympics, there was a Slack ad that kept running, and they played the Slack notification sound. And just there were so many tweets about people being like, please don't put that on an ad. This is it sort of fills your entire body with dread and horror when you hear it out of context, because you're like, oh no, my boss is looking for me. I'm not at my computer. Anyway, so I want to write about that.
I think that'll be fun. That will be interesting. But there's always been those, I don't want to say tools, but there's always been those ways, right, that we keep an eye on or a finger on our employees.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And so this just is the current one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because we're all working remotely, I think it has an outsized power. So, yeah, I've heard of people looking up 8-hour-long YouTube videos and just hitting play and then putting the video on mute and then walking away from their computer so that their Slack never goes idle. Which is so messed up.
And that really goes to the thing you brought up early on, is that balance of your work and your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of that. I'm going to use it again. That's a lot of that reckoning that's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And I think that ties into what you talked about being the only or the first.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think people just don't want to be miserable. They don't want to work as much as we work. And I don't think we need to. So.
No, I don't think we need to. I would agree with you there. Well, Alex, I appreciate you coming on and giving us a little look into the cohort and what you're doing. How can people, if they want to get on the newsletter, they want to follow you? Obviously, you're on the socials.
Yes. They can follow me on Twitter at AlexLaughs, spelled just how it sounds. And then I don't have the URL for the cohort memorized, but the way I always find it is I just search Poynter, the cohort, and the SEO is really great. So it's usually the first link that comes up on Google.
I will attest. That's how I found it the first time.
Yeah. It's very easy to find.
Well, Alex, I appreciate the time. Good luck as you continue this and build that community.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That will wrap us up for this episode of the News Nirvana podcast. We'll talk to everybody next time. The News Nirvana podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or most any of your favorite podcast apps. The News Nirvana podcast is made possible by the generosity of Town News. Connect with Town News at townnews.com. The News Nirvana podcast is produced by Fredcasts. Think, speak, act,